We're a solutions-oriented organization. I really want to draw people's attention to this URL. I suspect many of you, when we get to the questions part of the time, and even in the questions you'll be raising via chat today, you'll be like, what are the available policy solutions? And I want to remind our constituency that we have a lot of this thought out in 5 frameworks: one about housing, one about family affordability, one about climate change, one about rejuvenating our health systems, and one about making provincial and federal budgets work fairly for young and old alike. And so you can find a lot of the solutions there. You'll hear from me often saying there's no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot. And we take pride in having articulated a lot of that silver buckshot in writing at our solutions tab. Much of our work in the earliest days of Gen Squeeze focused on policy solutions to help the generation raising young kids better balance enough time at home and enough time at work so they could afford those families that people are wanting to start. And we talked about improvements to parental leave and work-life balance, and in particular note, framed a national childcare recommendation around this theme of $10 a day childcare. And we take enormous pride in the fact that when the federal government eventually, slower than we would have liked, but eventually invested $30 billion into a national childcare system, they did so with the branding of $10 a day childcare, which just reflects the work that Gen Squeeze has been doing for years to ensure that childcare doesn't cost another rent or mortgage-sized payment. But because we talked so often about childcare not being another rent or mortgage-sized payment, we did have a lot of our community say, can you not work more on housing affordability? So back around 2013, 2014, we started moving into this space. And I'm proud that we've worked with thought leaders and experts from coast to coast to come up with a synthesis of the broad range of policy levers we need to pull to restore housing affordability forever. And we've broken it down into 3 broad streams that we need to, actually 3 broad trails we need to climb to reach the pinnacle summit, given the infographic I have before us. Yeah, and many of the things people will have heard some about in the past, that we absolutely need to be scaling up more deeply affordable housing through our nonprofit sector. Right now, that's about 5, 6, 7% of the housing in the country. Imagine that we're doubled or tripled or quadrupled. We need to be aspiring to move in that direction. Simultaneously, though, the majority of Canadians are going to continue to rely on the regular market to make a home. And so we've got to fix what's going on in the regular housing market, ensuring that, we are dialing down some of the harmful kinds of demand that come from speculators and those who don't live here and those who want homes that are going to be treated more as hotels for visitors rather than places for locals to live, etc. But one of the key things that Gen Squeeze has observed when we have been articulating these ideas over the last 6, 7, 8 years is that all of these actions need to be taken, and many now have. But they often are not enough because there's this broader underlying problem in Canada that we have both individually at the household level and economically and politically in the world of politics, an addiction to high and rising home values. And it's that addiction to home prices rising and rising, which is, the reason we've tolerated it happening for year after year after year, causing this massive gap between home prices and what people actually earn. And so more and more Generation Squeeze is saying, many others are working on the low-hanging fruit, some of those easier issues to villainize. And we've been trying to take on this harder conversation about how regular folks, myself included, are entangled in the expectation that home prices are going to rise as we plan for our savings and as our political leaders plan to grow our economies. And so much of our work, including in Ottawa this week, is focused on encouraging governments to reduce our reliance on real estate to grow our economy, to think about ensuring we design tax policies so that sleep in a owned home doesn't, reward people more than does hard work in our day jobs. And to think about the ways in which there can be collateral damage from the access to cheap credit, which is used disproportionately in our economy to bid up the price of buildings that already exist. But whether we're talking about housing or families or climate change or healthcare, we're ultimately wanting people to see that some of the many challenges that we face today in Canada, they're all symptoms of an underlying disease. And that underlying disease is a dysfunctional intergenerational system. And so we absolutely have a range of detailed policy solutions for housing and climate and family and health and making our budgets work fairly for young and old alike. And I'm happy to take questions with Kareem later on today if that's where people's attention wants to drive. But at the same time, I hope more and more we can get our constituency that's interested in coming to community calls to help draw the connections to that underlying disease and see that part of the strategy to make change, to solve housing and make family life more affordable and fight climate change, those require us to better enshrine responsibility for generational fairness more explicitly into the machinery of government. And that has been a big part of what our focus in this week in Ottawa has been. We're making headway both provincially and federally. I'm delighted to share with people joining the call today that we have been working closely, for instance, with the BC Premier, who has tasked the Deputy Finance Minister of that government to add what will be the first ever age analysis of government spending ever published in a provincial budget. And this is really historic because whereas in previous years, Gen Squeeze would go to budget lockups in Ontario and BC and elsewhere, and we would have to crunch the numbers ourselves during the lockup about what was published in the budget, and then go and race out and be in front of media to try and grab some public attention, to findings that show, for instance, in BC that the government was growing spending for an older demographic, people that we love, at a rate that's 2.5 times faster than what they were doing for those people's kids and grandchildren. But now, rather than Gen Squeeze needing to be doing that, we can actually count on the actual financial documents published by a province starting to acknowledge as much, and that will bring much more public attention to the issue. And so we're really appreciative of the work that's going on with the BC Premier's office, and fingers crossed, you'll see some of this analysis creep into the budget in time for 2024. Similarly, we are working a lot at the federal level, which is why that we're in Ottawa this week. And it does reflect some progress. As last summer, we were invited to go and brief the Prime Minister and his entire cabinet. We were invited to do so on youth issues. And one of the first things that I pointed out when having a chance to confer with cabinet was, you will never see that phrase youth issues on the Gen Squeeze website. Because while it's absolutely critical that we draw our attention to what's going on for younger people, framing it as youth issues tends to distract our attention from the root causes of the problems facing younger generations. And those root causes had less to do with what young folks are doing and more to do with their treatment by previous governments as a result of past policy decisions. Those decisions, made back in the day, were predicted to be giving rise to problems that we are now seeing come to fruition. It's like that expression, the chickens will come home to roost, and then they eventually do. We are at a place where chickens are roosting, and some of them are some bad policy chickens. And I hope many of you will have already seen our most recent video where we playfully draw attention to some of those past bad policy decisions. Let me water ski over them really quickly for us today so that we can move on to some of the public dialogue amongst our community. The first is, it's really easy for us to think everything seems to be breaking now, so it must be the current government's fault, whether it's the federal Liberals or the Ontario Conservatives or the BC NDP provincial government. But really, so much of the housing trouble that we are running into stems from decisions, for instance, the one made in 1949, when Statistics Canada began measuring housing inflation as part of its calculation of the Consumer Price Index, so the overall measurement of inflation. And you might be surprised to learn that when thinking about the way in which housing was experienced for home ownership purposes, that StatsCan didn't monitor how much does one need to save to cover the down payment for a typically priced home. How much does one need to borrow as a mortgage to cover what's left over after the down payment? Those are not issues that are front and center in the measurement of inflation in this country. What is focused on is, from the standpoint of someone who's already a homeowner, what amount of interest are you paying on whatever you borrowed to cover your mortgage? And that had this really counterintuitive effect that as interest rates went down, that declined the interest payments that people were making. And so it made people were getting told to the Bank of Canada that, housing was more affordable. But it lost sight of the fact that there is a dark side to the cheap credit system, that when it's easy to borrow cheap money from banks, what do we do in Canada? We borrow larger sums of money. We then use that disproportionately to go bid up the price of homes that are already built, not making them better, not giving them a new roof necessarily or a nicer kitchen, just bidding up the price of what's already there. then Stats Canada doesn't go and actually capture that issue in its measurement of housing inflation. And so it sends the wrong signals to the Bank of Canada. And you'll see this vicious cycle perpetuates itself where we keep disproportionately low interest rates that have inflated housing prices. Now, when we gave this analysis some years ago, this really resonated with people. Of course, we've seen dramatic 10 rate hikes of late, but nevertheless, understanding how the mismeasurement of housing inflation has been integral to the housing challenges we face today is critical for solving the problem and not letting it get worse into the future. I suspect there's nobody on this call today who won't have heard that, there is a strong resistance growing in the world of politics to the price on pollution. And indeed, there's an Axe the pollution price campaign that's underway. We've seen that, in fact, government at the federal level has made some concessions to that in Atlantic Canada. And I think it really reflects that somehow we have been putting in, there's an affordability challenge and there's a climate challenge. And, these two things are competing. But at Gen Squeeze, we know from a generational fairness standpoint, you just can't solve our wallet problems by neglecting our climate problems. We solve wallet problems by making childcare more affordable, by fixing the housing system, by making retirement income security more in reach for people. Then we better position people to manage the costs that are required to adapt to climate change. Because if we pollute but don't pay for it, we are simply leaving environmental damage and the cost to fix it to our kids, grandchildren, and future generations. And last but not least, back in the 50s and 60s, when we were designing our retirement income security systems and our medical care systems, governments failed to come up with a revenue plan that was going to ensure we had the dollars available and collected from our baby boom family members so that they had that to draw down when they were in retirement. This is a pictorial description of the 2023 federal budget, which shows that the bulk of spending is going towards our family members who are later in their lives. Indeed, just the new spending on old age security alone is greater than all of the spending on employment insurance, childcare, poverty reduction for families with kids, the clean economy. All of that combined is less than what we were doing to increase spending on old age security alone. And that dynamic is now pressuring our budgets because we're needing to figure out, where are we finding that new spending? And it reflects this failure back in the day that when boomers started out as young people, they were paying taxes at a level that was possible because there were 7 working age adults for every retiree. But now, as retirees, baby boomers understandably want to have the same, if not better, services in their retirement. And these are our family members. I think my mom is on this call. We want to protect my mom. But we're having to do that when there were just 3 working age adults for every retiree today. The consequences for young people's tax dollars and for government's ability to have fiscal restraint are absolutely enormous. And just at the federal budget level alone, there is a projected over the next 4 years, $132 billion in deficit spending, even though we are not in a recession. And fully 84% of that is due to increased spending on old age security and medical care for those over 65. Which brings me back to our overarching need to recognize that there is this underlying disease of a broken generational system, an intergenerational tension or unfairness in our world of politics. And we need to vanquish that intergenerational tension in order to solve our housing and family affordability and climate change problems. I'm pleased that this week we are making more progress at the federal level. I was lucky enough to be at the Prime Minister's office today, meeting there where they convened chiefs of staff of 4 different ministries to think about how to move forward on something like a rapid response task force on generational fairness that could help to draw attention to the kinds of challenges that I've been drawing your attention to today. We're not moving as quickly as I would like to see, but progress is underway. So my fingers remain crossed that we can actually integrate into the federal level greater commitments to generational fairness. But we're going to need your help because there are people out there who don't find our analysis and the evidence or the values in which we are meshing that evidence to be compelling. And this is an email I received earlier this week in response to my latest Globe and Mail article. And you can see that, much of what I presented to you today was interpreted by this individual to be sanctimonious dribble. Or others have, more succinct ways of encouraging me to say less on the issue. And I think most concerningly, There are actual organizations out there that are intentionally misrepresenting the evidence that we are presenting and misrepresenting what we are calling for at government levels in order to drum up their own support, their own fundraising for their own purposes. And that then makes it harder for us to do our work provincially and federally. And so we need to have our own constituency, our own posse of allies who can help us, take action to resist some of that, misframing of what's going on at Generation Squeeze. And we hope that as part of this call, you'll start to think about how might you add your voice in support of our call for a rapid response generational fairness task force that can help address the fact that hard work isn't paying off for younger Canadians today as it did for past generations, and better position our country to work fairly once again for all generations. As part of that, we hope that if you haven't already watched our Policy Chickens Coming Home to Roost video, that you'll do so and then share it with others in your community in the hopes that they too will lend their support for the task force idea. I think most critically, we're hoping that any of the keeners who are coming out for this call today, could you go to gensqueeze.ca/share_story and tell us your reflections about why intergenerational fairness matters and why you might think that a government launching a task force to promote generational fairness in public policy would actually be historic, because we can then use those stories to help us make the case that there is ample political cover for our politicians to courageously respond to the data that shows Canada isn't working well for young and old alike. Today's call, brings us together at one synchronous moment, but so much of our conversation can carry on after the call in our community dialogue space that we have set up at Substack. I think there's more and more despair about places like Twitter, and a younger demographic isn't that active on Facebook. So we are really investing time in our Substack space and invite you to carry on the conversations there with us that we start today, if you haven't already joined. And after today's call, we will send you a note asking, hey, what did you think about the community call? What did you like? Because we are an organization that is in a constant path to self-improvement and wanting to be more responsive to the needs and interests of our community. So in closing, we need our alliance of 40,000 plus members of the Gen Squeeze community to increasingly support our work to preserve Canada's status as one of the greatest places on earth in which to grow old, as ranked by Global Age Watch, and also help us to overcome our status as an international laggard when it comes to investing in children and youth and their parents, as reported on an annual basis by UNICEF. We need to bind together both of these ambitions to be excellent at both ends of the life course so that we once again make our country work well for all generations. Thanks, and I can't wait for the questions.
Thanks for that, Paul. I know I always find it motivating and exciting to hear you discuss this stuff, and I hope others agree. And I would just add to the last point you made there, I find it amazing that we can be at both ends of that spectrum. We can be so good at providing a great life for retirement and growing old in Canada, but at the same time, we're just not investing in that same future for young people. So I think that makes so clear why we're doing what we're doing. Now we have one question that's come in so far. I encourage everyone else to send in their questions and comments. Again, you can do that in the chat to everyone, or you can send them to myself or Megan or Andrea, and we'll read those out. The first one we have is, why do you focus so much on this task force that you're talking about here? Don't you worry that this kind of tool will be all talk and little action? So what do you think about that, Paul?
Well, what a smart community to ask that as the first question. I don't want anyone to think that the task force is the end game. The task force is part of a strategy to set up an enabling condition. We need to do more to solve housing and affordability, and to invest more urgently in childcare and other family supports, and to make sure we pay for our pollution and reduce the risks of extreme weather. But in order to get there, we need to have some of the more challenging conversations about these intergenerational tensions. And if we don't have the machinery of government helping to shine a light on that, then what actually happens is the machinery of government shines its light in other places. And that then makes it harder for us to break through. And so the task force, is being proposed at this moment because we do know that there's a political opportunity for us to take advantage of. A younger demographic that polling is showing is sort of fleeing from the current government to other parties. As a result, they're feeling vulnerable and like, how can we attract a younger demographic back? And how can we safeguard the retirement of the parents and grandparents in their lives? And so we have framed that a task force on generational fairness is a way to show you're doing something that no government has done before. And that then gets us influencing the machinery of government in ways that create new opportunity to say, okay, and we're making some progress on housing, but here's some sticky issues we haven't yet tackled. And the same goes for climate change or healthcare policy, et cetera. So that's why it is an enabling condition, not the end game. But boy, it could sure accelerate our work if we were to win this change at the federal level, much like we're trying at the provincial level to build into their budgeting, a reporting that actually showcases these age trends so that we don't have to be a little nimble group outside, but the machinery of government does it, which will then attract so much more media attention and policy attention.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I like how you put it, the machinery of government. I think this is something that people are pretty, they don't really believe it can make a difference at this point. But I think something we've been trying to point out to people is it's that these policies that were made in the past that has caused so many of these problems we're seeing today. And we can't just ignore those and try and solve this ourselves outside of government. We need to really get in there and get the right policies made. Now we have another question from Dawn. How do you think the new BC Airbnb law around restricting short-term rentals to only primary residences will affect housing prices and rents? How do you think this policy plays out, good or bad? Criticisms. Do you think Airbnbs and short-term rentals have hurt housing affordability?
Oh, yes, this is good. Last part of the question first. Yes, short-term rentals is part of the problem. It's one of a multifaceted set of problems that we're facing. If you go to the gensqueeze.ca website and look for reports, you'll see that some years ago, we actually published, I think, one of the earliest set of frameworks to give to municipalities to help them better regulate short-term rentals. And we're delighted to see a provincial level response unfolding in BC and have encouraged that that takes place in other places, especially in Ontario, because we do need to preserve housing first and foremost for locals who live, work, and study there, and not have it be hotels for those who are vacationers. That said, it's one part of the issue. I think it will make a difference. It will release more supply that's currently available to renters in the short term, which is good because building new stuff takes a while. But we have to do that in concert with a variety of other things, dialing down other kinds of harmful demand, building new supply, especially large enough homes with enough bedrooms for families with kids. And we're going to have to ask people like me who've been benefiting from rising home prices to think about how we can get off the sidelines and be more of the solution to invest in deeply affordable housing. Great question.
Yeah, I do like that one as well. Another one here from Uric.
Sorry, how can we convince? Can I just pause and just see? Now I see in the chat that people are asking questions of my mom, which is just making me giggle. Hi, Mom. I can't see you on the screen, but love you.
How can we convince our leaders that intergenerational fairness and affordable housing is actually good for the economy?
Oh, well, I think when you're growing your economy in a way where GDP is rising, but the major cost of living is growing out of reach for what local earnings are paying, that's just a recipe for having an economy that doesn't promote thriving. And so if we want thriving, if we want hard work to be able to cover the major cost of living, then absolutely revising our housing policy will get us more focused on that. It may mean in the short term, ironically, that GDP might not grow as much. But that means groups like ours need to say, we don't hold you accountable to GDP being the one metric to rule them all when it comes to have a signal of a strong economy. And so I definitely think it's pretty straightforward to showcase that younger generations are being locked out of housing, even when they have good educations and good paying jobs. And then those who are like relatively well educated and good paying, and let's just be clear, we tend to attract a lot of those at Gen Squeeze. They then are going for the housing we would have thought was sort of more available for the middle earners. And then the middle earners go for the housing that we thought might have been there for the working poor. And then the working poor taking the social housing we thought we were going to use to bring people off the streets into. And so you can just see that this is a classic trickle down problem. And we need to be fixing the housing system and recognizing that housing is really changing class dynamics. And those of us who've been well housed for some time have been kind of catapulted out of the middle class, often into the more privileged group. And income now, even if it looks like a strong signal of like, oh, you have a good earnings, it doesn't matter as much if the cost of living is out of reach. So that would be part of what I would frame. And intergenerational fairness is, is so critical to fixing our housing market. So that is, part and parcel of restoring an economy that promotes thriving for young and old alike.
Yeah, and I would add to that, there's all these statistics that have been coming out recently showing that like we haven't been generationally fair, as we've discussed, in terms of the climate. We've let things deteriorate, and that explicitly is costing economies all over the world billions and billions of dollars. So I don't think it's hard to convince, it shouldn't be hard at least to convince politicians these days, because all the statistics and data are out there. And I think it's exciting that politicians seem to be realizing this now. After you brief the Liberal cabinet at the retreat, Paul Trudeau came out, and I think the next day he was making promises to younger Canadians and talking about how his government will focus on these issues. So I think we are making some progress there. The next question from Grant is, first time, long time, wondering if there's any specific call for individual or institutional involvement, collaboration beyond sharing the chicken video and promoting the task force.
Yeah, great question. So I was multitasking there. I think the question was, beyond sharing the video, what can organizations do? Did I summarize that right?
I think more what can people do? I think people are excited and interested and just want to help us. So yeah, what would we ask of them?
Yeah. We're really in the business of reframing people's beliefs about what are the problems and what are the solutions, and then creating enough political cover for politicians to be able to courageously respond to that evidence and respond to people's stories. And so it may not sound like a lot to ask people to share your observations about how intergenerational fairness impacts your life. But, I saw an earlier comment where somebody's like, oh, it sounds like, we're pitting generations against one another. This is absolutely the kryptonite of Generation Squeeze. We're not pitting the generations against one another. Our vision is one of intergenerational solidarity. Just as we can draw distinctions between people of color and people of pallor like me, or between women and men as we fight sexism, or between people who have come to Canada and between First Nations. Like, these kinds of distinctions are made in order to draw attention to systemic problems. Similarly, now we're needing to draw attentions to systemic issues in order to shine a light on them so that we can overcome them. But if there's the risk that drawing the comparison seems to be, perceived as pitting generations against one another, we need younger folks to come and say, we care about the financial security and health of our parents and grandparents. And we need those parents and grandparents to say, we care about the legacy we are leaving for our kids and grandchildren. And when we combine together both of those voices by the stories that we're asking you to share and by the numbers in our constituency, that contributes so critically to building the political cover that politicians require to respond to the data.
Okay, next question here is from Chris that sends in a very real question that I think will resonate with a lot of people. So Chris says, I'm discouraged from believing that any of the leading parties will take housing affordability seriously, even when the federal NDP leader pretends like we can return housing to affordable prices while locking in the capital gains of homeowners. Is it realistic and desirable for Gen Squeeze to work towards forming a new party that makes real housing affordability central to their platform?
Wow, what a big, ambitious question. I will confess that, a decade ago when we started Gen Squeeze and I had this grand vision of like, oh, we're going to attract like 1 million people. And then we can turn that into, some sort of, having all the machinations of a political party, but maybe it can turn into something like that. I will argue I don't see that's how Canadian politics works. So I think that we need to transform those parties or attract those parties to see that it's in their political interest to say and do things that can be somewhat politically controversial. And, where I think that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And right now, Pierre Poilievre's team has done quite a remarkable job adopting, if not appropriating, the Gen Squeeze narrative. Young people are doing everything right, but they're trapped in their basements. And then they're taking our definition of the squeeze on younger Canadians, but not moving into the policy area where we identify solutions. They just fall into the easy moment of, it's the fault of the guy in office now. And that gets distracting. And so that's kind of working against the solutions we need. Alternatively, at the federal Liberal level, here, I think that group hasn't done enough to acknowledge the grief that a younger demographic is feeling in regards to sort of this dream that, a good home should be in reach for what hard work can earn. And I think Mr. Poilievre is doing more to tap into that group. We need to help the governing party do that as well. Because their success depends on finding solutions. They can't just, do the easy politicization. And then at the NDP level, it's whether you're thinking nationally with Mr. Singh or provincially with Mr. Canoe and Mr. Eby, I think I nailed all three NDP governments right now. I think there are opportunities, especially in BC, where we have been the epicenter of the insanity of housing for longer than elsewhere. And so I do think it's notable that the NDP premier used to be the housing minister. And I think it's really great to have his familiarity there. So I guess this is a long-winded answer as I'm thinking about it on the spot. I apologize. Don't lose hope. We got to make the political parties work. The prospects of creating a whole new party, maybe some people just have grander abilities than I do, but I suspect that's longer than trying to simply reframe what are the dominant concerns of the day and then reframe what people see as the dominant solutions. I think that's the business Gen Squeeze is inviting us all into together. And I'm hoping that this call is one part of growing that reach.
Well, I understand why we're taking the approach we're taking, Paul, but if you ever do decide to run, you have my vote.
That's very kind of you.
Okay, so next question is from Cassandra, who says, pardon my possible ignorance. And no, Cassandra, just because you have a question about one of our policies doesn't mean it's ignorant. And we always welcome these sorts of interesting questions like the one you have. But you ask, I'm curious as to how paying for pollution will solve the affordable housing crisis when this affects the cost of utilities, which also affects renters.
Yeah, so let there be no mistake. I don't think there's any part of Gen Squeeze that says putting a price on pollution is intended to solve the housing affordability crisis. What we're saying is we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able to fight for housing affordability and fight for a safe and sustainable climate. The latter is absolutely going to be served by having a price on pollution. We are not sanguine about the fact that can put added financial pressures on renters, homeowners, et cetera, which means we have to better position them to ease their wallet pressures in other ways. The affordability crisis isn't because we put a price on pollution. The affordability crisis is in large part because for the last many decades, we've allowed folks like me to extract so much wealth from the housing system that we leave little affordability left over. That's what's really been causing housing unaffordability in our country. So let's keep our eye on the prize about the key sources of that, reduce those pressures, and that better positions us also to have to accept a new responsibility to say, if we're making a mess, we need to clean it up. That's what polluting is, making a mess. And for decades, governments let us off the hook. We collectively let ourselves off the hook. Polluting for people and businesses was free or at little cost. And the result is species loss, rising food costs, and extreme weather. And so we need this both and approach. But I don't want anyone to think that we're saying the price on pollution solves housing unaffordability. It will give signals, though, that as we build new housing, and we're building a lot of it right now, we have to build it green. It has to be as energy efficient as possible because a big chunk of our carbon emissions come from our buildings, and we need the right incentives to make those buildings as green as possible. Next.
Okay, so the next question, I think Ken and Floyd from Commonwealth will be very excited to hear because this is an area that they work in. So Trevor asks, and he has some policy ideas that Trevor is looking for some comments on. So what about progressive property taxation, things like higher property taxes in general, land taxes rather than building taxes, per family member exemptions akin to personal income taxes. Do you have any thoughts on those sort of more progressive policies, Paul?
Yeah, and whose name was asking that? I didn't catch it.
This is Trevor.
Trevor, welcome to the call. And it kind of makes me happy that you don't know we're an organization that's at the forefront of making the case for why we need to add progressivity to property taxation. Because when I get people sending me emails and saying, I hope you die, it is more often than not because of our positions on adding progressivity to property taxation. The long and short of it is we need a tax shift. We need to reduce taxes on middle, lower earners in particular, especially renters, and we can replace the lost revenue by increasing taxes on unhealthy levels of housing wealth. I would absolutely be in that category of people who have gained that unhealthy levels of housing wealth. And so reduce taxes on income because we want people to have better incomes. We don't want housing prices to rise. So just like a price on pollution, the logic is raise revenue on things you want less of to, take pressures off things you want more of. The same logic happens to apply perfectly with regards to housing unaffordability. As home values rise and rise and rise, especially for people who've been reaping wealth over years, they've been in the market for some time. Progressivity on property taxation is a good way to go. I see Ken from Commonwealth is here. They do talk a lot about land value taxation, kind of shifting in that way, in a Georgist way, really ambitiously. I think generally speaking, I tend to say to people, I'm not so sure about the distinction, at least for rhetorical purposes, between buildings and land, because you can get some very expensive condos in the GTA and Metro Vancouver. And I wouldn't want to be exempting people living in $2.5 million condos from the opportunity to contribute more to our housing affordability needs and aspirations.
Okay, so I haven't had a chance yet to ask you how your day is going over there, Paul, but I think this question from Steve will give you an opportunity to tell us about a bit about what you're doing, the change part of Generation Squeeze as a think and change tank, and how we're going about trying to create the change that we want to see. So Steve says, as a senior, I've heard the political speak for years, promises, yet no execution. You mention Pierre's statements, but no policy will emerge, as it never does until an election happens. So how do we push politicians to actually deliver?
Here, I wonder if I can move my slides right now. Wait, let me just get to something. Okay, well, if you want to understand the Gen Squeeze theory of change, here's one quick summary about it. And, this motivates why we're in Ottawa, why we go to other provincial capitals, why we work hard to shape media. I mean, the punchline for so much of our work as a change tank is that governments respond to those who organize and show up. So it begs the question, how do you get people to organize and show up? What does organizing and showing up look like? And the think tank of us says, okay, people are likely to kind of get involved and lean in the ways that people are doing by joining our call today when they see that, hey, there's socioeconomic changes going on around us. And we can use the evidence from the academy and elsewhere to make meaning of those changes in the light of people's values. And when we make that meaning, we have the following goals. We want to shape public opinion generally. We want more and more people saying, we care about intergenerational fairness. As we're doing that, we can then frame people's beliefs specifically about what are the problems with regards to housing and climate change and family affordability and childcare and so on. And in particular about the solutions. What are the solutions that will solve these issues? And more often than not, we have a harder time with that because there's no silver bullet. We have to talk about the complexity of the silver buckshot. But if we can get people to lean into that complexity, we can say, and right now we're setting an agenda to do these 2 or 3 things. Part of which is our call for a generational fairness task force. We're getting people focused. It's not the sexiest thing. It's not the game changer. It's a key enabling condition. And then you build person power around that agenda. So you have a coalition and people who are joining today, and you see, we've asked you, hey, show your support for a Gen Fairness task force. That's part of building a coalition. Because then we can suit up in the halls of power and spread out as voices from coast to coast to coast to marshal the evidence, marshal the public opinion, marshal people's values, and marshal the person power to change the incentives to which politicians respond. That is really what political science will tell us, is how politics works. And so as a think and change tank, we are trying to play in that space as effectively as we can. And meetings like today, which bring talented people like you together, are part and parcel of our doing so. Because if we have enough opportunity to frame for people, younger folks are kind of moving around searching for a political party that will acknowledge their grief and say we'll do something historic to address it, all while protecting the needs for a healthy retirement for their parents and grandparents. Binding those two things together, I think, is what Canadians care about, and that can win parties elections if they frame it well, and winning elections is what they're incentivized to do. That's the messages that we've been spreading provincially and federally, including this week in Ottawa.
All right, so the next question here is from Suzanne. And Suzanne says, the notion of winners versus losers and us versus them feels ever present in this work. So what's the messaging on this, just to get people to learn more?
Suzanne. I think I mentioned earlier, it might have been your note in the chat that just caught my eyes. And that's something I feel so sensitive to personally. It is our kryptonite. It is this way that that issues can be discounted. And so, Mom, I don't know if you're on there, but it's like raise your hand. I'm so delighted my mom is joining us today, because that's really modeling the intergenerational solidarity that matters. I hope you'll know that I want nothing less than for my mom to have a long and healthy and financially secure retirement. I want to be with her for as many years as is possible. And my mom wants to leave a legacy that is proud for her kids and grandchildren. We see that love around family tables all of the time, and as quirky or cheesy as it sounds, really Jen Squeeze is in the business of wanting to bring that family love around the family table into the world of politics and use that as an antidote to the short-termism that dominates political cycles. Now, at certain moments, we need to tell some hard truths. That's why the name of our podcast is Hard Truths. We need to tell hard truths to a range of people, which can include some of the older family members in our lives. And it can be hard to tell that grumpy uncle that, I know you work hard in the day, but you need to recognize that we're working hard now too, and it's not paying off like it used to. It really is like we're walking up, uphill in the snow both ways everywhere we're going. That was a nice metaphor back in the day, but it's almost the reality now for young folks. And so those hard truths can be hard to hear, but it's part of a process not to pit us against one another, but to invite that solidarity, which is so common around our family tables, into the world of politics. And I said as much today in meetings in the Prime Minister's office, that this is something that people who are wanting to resist the rage farming, which does opposition parties so much good, and an antidote to that farming for anger is, you can tap into the love. You've got to be honest that things aren't going well for a younger demographic. We need to acknowledge that grief, but then we can use that intergenerational love and solidarity to turn it around. I think we are running out of time rapidly these days.
We are, yeah. And Christine, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. You've had your hand up for a while there, but maybe we can unmute Christine and hear what she has to say.
I think if you now hit unmute on your screen, Christine, you will individually do that. I hope you have permission. Oh, Megan.
Okay, here we
go.
Thanks so much. This has been really great. I'll kind of try to formulate my thoughts to compose a question here. But essentially, I have been looking into the concepts of sanctioned corruption within the relationship between corporations or organizations that hold a lot of wealth and their contributions to political parties through lobbying and donations. I am aware that there is this Lobbyist Registration Act, which I think was put in place to try to deter some of that corporate power through wealth. But I was specifically looking into this in terms of the fossil fuel industry and the impact on what policies are put in place in terms of the legislation around pipelines and different activities like this. I'm curious if the same applies to the housing industry, if you're aware of any kind of sanctioned corruption and at what role the kind of corporate elite related to land speculation and private property ownership And just also tying that in with this idea of how so many activist groups, like especially here in Montreal, are like really against landlords, right? But to me, I feel like there's a huge distinction between those who have corporate power that are accumulating wealth at very high amounts because of private property versus a landlord that's just trying to get by and maybe is renting their basement or something. Anyways, the question is, what's your familiarity around like sanctioned corruption on the housing level?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking from a Quebec standpoint for a non-Quebec example of sanctioned corruption around housing, you might want to turn your attention to all that's been written about the Green Belt in Ontario and the land that was taken out and then put back in as part of a sort of speculative set of corrupting influences that was done under the guise of trying to promote housing affordability. I think more generally, I would encourage us to recognize that if we can channel some private, including corporate investment, to build new purpose-built rental where rental doesn't already exist, that's actually a net win. This channeling private investment for public good. What we've seen a lot of the time from corporations, REITs, pension funds is sort of buying up existing rental, then sort of playing around with maybe upgrading it, but then they displace who was already living there. And so that the rent evictions and the dem evictions have been tremendously harmful. But if we could channel more private investment into building stuff that doesn't yet exist, that's a win. And we do have to be worried about sort of the amateur mom and pop landlord, because what the data show is that so much of the new housing that's being built is being bought by people over the age of 55. Because they've been able to draw on the capital that they've benefited from rising home prices, and they're outbidding young people and newcomers of any age. And so then you have the young people and newcomers paying the rents to people that pays off their mortgage, as opposed to getting into the housing system and a bit of equity for themselves. And so, the corporate elite has a role to play, but we don't want to camouflage some of the harm that a kind of amateur landlord, regular person has been contributing to our housing system of late as well. That you asked a huge question. I scratched the surface of it. Happy to carry on the conversation afterwards. I would love to know if there's anyone out there who is thinking about like, oh, what story might I tell or share or write about, or what I might like to do, maybe even ideas we haven't thought about in terms of advancing the cause of generational fairness. I think information is critical, but the actions we take are so influential and so important, because people are less likely to follow ideas and more likely to follow other people. So I'm always curious to learn what our community is interested in doing.
Yeah, and maybe if anyone wants to tell one of those stories or ask a question verbally, you can feel free to raise your hand at this point. You click the reaction button on Zoom and then raise your hand, and we'll give you the opportunity to unmute. Here's Jay and Dawn. We only have a couple of minutes left also, so maybe keep your statements brief if possible.
If possible. That's hard with me, Kareem. But
nice to see you, Jay.
Yeah, love it. I guess my short story is like, basically, I'm here because a member of parliament and city councilor laughed at me. I misspoke at a community consultation on a community thing and about we wanted to raise money for it. So I'm in marketing. So I'm like, well, how many of the wealthy people live in our neighborhood? Like, how many of the wealthiest people in the world live in our little neighborhood, our community association? And like the member of parliament like laughed at me, and my city councilor too. And I thought it was weird. He used to run for the Green Party, and I thought he'd be. And one of them's like, I don't think the owner of the Ottawa Senators lives in our neighborhood, right? And I thought, then my neighbor laughed and said, I don't care about the wealthiest. I care about the poorest. Who are the poorest people? I want them to be involved in consultation, make sure we're getting the stuff they need in the thing, make sure that, and the MP and the counselor had amazing answers. They're like the social planning council. I was on the board of director of United Way. You can talk to this. There's academics researching this at University of Ottawa and at Carleton University. You can go here, you can go there. There's a community engagement group that is working right now with the city staff to engage underserved communities and how to properly engage them, right? You just can't demand an Indigenous community consults on this small community association building, right? and have it to you like tomorrow by Friday by noon. So that got me really engaged. And I'm, wait a second, like this housing stuff, like they're making decisions on where to put multi-million-dollar houses and having no idea how much wealth is there. Like, can anybody even afford it? Is it a person buying that house, or is it a corporation purchasing that house, tearing it down, making these like rooming houses, which is a lot we're coming in our community, and renting out room per room. And it was corporations buying a lot of these homes, REITs or something like that. And so anyways, I really like how you guys are framing the discussion, talking about this. And I like the words, the hard truth. That's what it is. They're hard truths and the past policy chickens. And I really like how we as citizens have that role to give our political leaders the space to address these hard truths. Because if we kick them out in one term, they're never going to do it. In the same way that corporations, if we as shareholders of the corporations kick them out for not achieving the highest profits, they're only going to work to achieve the highest profit quarter by quarter and no long-term vision.
Yeah, anyway, I think that's so interesting, Jay, that dichotomy that you've identified there, that we focus so much on the bad side of things, but no one has identified this wealth side of things as an issue. And we're excited to see the work that you put together, Jay. Everyone's he's written something for us that'll be coming out soon, so you can look forward to that. Don, I know you've had your hand up for a while here too. I see we only have 2 minutes left, so maybe you can take us out, and then I'll conclude after that quickly.
Okay, I'll be super fast.
Thanks.
So basically, everything that you've researched and talked and has touched our lives somehow when it comes to, like, we don't have daycare right now, so my mom's living with us to do daycare for our kid, and we don't have housing right now, so we're living in a resort, and just burning through cash to do that kind of thing, and so personally it's touched me a lot, but it's also touched literally every single person that I know, and I don't just mean in my generation, I mean in every other one, even my parents' generation too. When you think of the ripples of housing and things like that, I also work with people with developmental disabilities, and the housing's horrific in BC and across the province or across the country. But the ripples there it's just like people are just becoming homeless, obviously with so many different groups too. But one of the things that I think is interesting is a lot of people don't recognize that those ripples are coming from all of this, like, generational, the crisis kind of issues and stuff. So people will be like, oh man, like, there's no servers in the restaurant, or like, something like that, like whatever. And you're like, well, they can't afford to live here. So what do you think is going to happen? So it's just, I think one thing that's interesting about the whole task force idea is to try to get more people kind of together and involved and sort of on the same page. Because Pierre Poilievre has a huge voice, and he's capturing a huge amount of young people. And I don't know if his policies will help them necessarily. I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks to
thank you, Don,
for modeling, telling those stories. Sorry, I'm stealing Kareem's line probably.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty compelling what Don just said there. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Don. And we're glad that you have identified the sort of generational aspect of this, and we hope everyone here can help us spread the word so that we can all realize kind of what Paul showed there, how this is all tied together in his slide, all the peaks under the one generational fairness peak. Now we're 1 minute over time already. I know it's the middle of the day. Everyone is busy. So we'll finish up now. I'm sorry about any of the questions. I see there's a ton here that we weren't able to get to. Feel free to throw those on Substack, where we'll get to all of them as quickly as we can. And we, I think, have already sent or will be sending a feedback survey. I see it in the chat here. So it'd be amazing if you could fill that out. Let us know what you thought about this event and help us improve for the next one. So thank you, everyone. It was great to have you on today, and we hope to speak with you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you making time today. Onwards.